When you think about Christianity, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's a book, right? The Bible. We kind of assume it was there from day one, like the instruction manual for this new faith. But what if I told you that for decades, the very first Christians didn't have a New Testament? Yeah, that one single fact. It changes everything about how we understand the birth of a global movement. I mean, that's a huge paradox, isn't it? How on earth do you spread a complex faith, build communities, and establish a whole theology across an entire empire without your foundational texts? That's the big question we're going to tackle in this explainer. For that entire first generation of believers, the book we call the New Testament it didn't exist as a single collection. And look, this isn't some historical mistake or a flaw, it's actually a clue. And we're going to follow that clue to understand how they built their world. So to figure this out, we've got to start by busting a really common myth. The idea that Christianity was a religion of the book right from the get-go. As you're about to see, the real story is so much more interesting. So here's this pretty provocative claim from historian Harry Gamble. He basically argues that the early faith was so focused on the person of Jesus, on the community's immediate experience, that writing stuff down was almost an afterthought. It's a bold idea, for sure, and it gets us part of the way there. But is it the whole story? Well, not exactly. While Gamble is totally right that there was no New Testament, saying there were no Christian scriptures, that's a bit of an overstatement. You have to remember, the early church was born out of Judaism. The Hebrew scriptures, what Christians today call the Old Testament, were absolutely foundational. They weren't just background noise. They were seen as the prophetic engine driving the whole thing. Okay, so this is the key thing to get your head around. There's a huge difference between having a finished, closed list of books and having a canonical mindset. The first believers didn't have the final table of contents, but they absolutely had the category for holy, God-inspired text. They were already thinking in terms of which writings carried divine authority. And that right there brings us to a huge clue in our investigation. If they valued scripture so much, why the delay in writing their own? The answer lies in this massive cultural difference between their world and ours. Think about it. In our world today, we want everything in writing. A contract, a receipt, a transcript. The written text is proof, it's security. But in the ancient world, which was a primarily oral culture, the living voice held way more weight. The personal testimony of an eyewitness, direct teaching from someone who was actually there, that was seen as way more powerful and significant than just reading an account. So this timeline here kind of lays out how that big shift happened. For the first few decades, the living voices of the apostles and the other eyewitnesses were all you needed. But then, you get to this tipping point. That first generation, the people who actually walked with Jesus, they start to pass away. All of a sudden, there's this urgent need to preserve their testimony, to get that living voice down in writing before it was lost forever. This becomes the historical trigger for the Gospels and all the letters. All right, so if they didn't have the New Testament for all those years, how in the world did they pass on their core beliefs? Well, they had this incredibly powerful toolkit, a set of methods for transmitting their theology that didn't depend on having a finished book. And this toolkit, it rested on 4 main pillars that held up the entire faith of the early church. They had their existing scriptures, these short, memorable summaries, songs, and deeply symbolic rituals. Let's break each one down. So first up, like we've already said, the Hebrew scriptures were everything. The story of Jesus wasn't just told in a vacuum. It was presented as the grand climax of the story that started way back in Genesis. He was the fulfillment of all the prophecies and promises God had made to Israel for centuries. Second, they had what you could call doctrinal summaries, and you can basically think of these as the original theological sound bites, short, carefully worded statements that were super easy to memorize and pass from person to person. They captured the absolute essentials of the faith. And here's a perfect example of that. When the Apostle Paul writes this to the church at Corinth, he makes a point to say it's a tradition he received. You hear that? He's not making this up on the spot. He's passing on something that was already a well-known foundational belief. This short, powerful, portable summary of the gospel that was circulating long before he ever wrote his letter. And the third pillar, it was music. I mean, think about it. In a culture that's mostly oral, what's the absolute best way to make a complex idea stick in people's brains? You set it to music. For the early church, theology was often sung long before it was ever systematically written down. A lot of scholars actually think this beautiful passage here in Philippians is one of those early hymns just embedded right into the New Testament text. And wow, just listen to the theology packed in there. It's this profound statement about the divinity, the humanity, the sacrifice, and the exaltation of Jesus, all of it contained in a song that the early church would have known completely by heart. And that brings us to the fourth and final pillar. Theology wasn't just something you heard, it was something you saw and something you did. The rituals or sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper were these powerful, reoccurring visual aids that taught core truths. So with baptism, believers were physically acting out a picture of Jesus' death and resurrection. And then by sharing in the Lord's Supper, they were constantly reminded of the new relationship, this new covenant they had with God because of Christ's sacrifice. These weren't just empty ceremonies, they were living, breathing lessons. Okay, so what's the big deal? Why does any of this history matter for us today? Well, it completely reframes how we understand the nature of the Christian faith and the book that came to represent it. You see, the journey to the New Testament we hold in our hands today, it was a whole process. It started with the raw power of the living voice of eyewitnesses. That voice was then preserved and passed down through this vibrant lived theology of community practices. Only then was it captured in written texts, which were finally recognized over time as a holy canon. So here's the bottom line. The Christian faith didn't start with a book. It started as this dynamic, lived experience. The book we have today is the product of that experience. It's a testament to a faith that was first spoken, sung, and acted out within a real community. And that really leaves us with something to chew on, doesn't it? Knowing that these texts were born from oral testimony, from creeds spoken out loud, and from hymns sung in worship, how might that change the way we approach reading them today? It's something to think about.